Hi, I'm Adam Porter and this is my board gaming vlog, and we're looking at my top 100 games of all time, and here we're looking at numbers 90 through to 81. So in that first 10 what we found was that I quite like flicking games, I quite like dice games, and I like games about anthropomorphic animals. So let's see how many more of those games make the list and what other types of games might pull ahead. So number 90 on my list is Bonanza, which is a card game from Uwe Rosenberg and Rio Grande Games. And in this game, you have a bunch of bean cards and you lay them out in your hand, but they have to stay in the same order. So you can never shift the cards around in your hand. They must stay in the same order. And then when you're playing, you're going to have to play the card at the very front of your hand. That's the card you're going to have to play. So there's lots of, so you're kind of forced into certain positions, but the game is all about negotiation. You can trade cards with the other players, which frees up the other cards in your hand and prevents you from having to play cards that you don't want. You're trying to build up stacks of cards that are matching in order to score points or coins in this game. And yeah, it's another game that's really, really interactive. It's all about the table talk, the negotiation. The artwork is odd. It's a bit ugly and so on, but in a really sort of cute way. I like it. It's got a lot of personality. I've always felt Bonanza runs on a little bit too long for the experience that it offers. You know, I really enjoy the experience. I'd rather it ended a little bit sooner, but it is really, really fun. So yeah, I had to include it on the list. Number 89 on the list is a game called Dr. Eureka. This is a logic puzzle with a degree of dexterity in it. So you're tipping these little balls from one tube into another, trying to match the pattern that's on the card. And obviously, you know, if you've got a ball at the bottom of the tube, then the only way you're going to get that out is by tipping the other balls out first, but then you're wrecking what's in the other tubes. And so it's a speed puzzle. You're racing against time. You're under time pressure, racing against the other players to try and complete this pattern. There's not that much to it, but it is really, really satisfying and fun. You can play it with young players, but it's really challenging for older players as well. I think as speed puzzles go, it's certainly one of the best. It's great production, again, from Blue Orange Games. So highly recommended, Dr. Eureka. And number 88 is Babylonia from Knizia. Now, Knizia is, he's produced hundreds of games. You know, this is the most prolific board game designer in the world, and not all of them are of the same quality as the top rung ones. Clearly, there's hundreds of them, but the top ones are really, really good. Because he produces so many, I think over the years the games have got smaller and smaller and lighter and simpler, and so it was really nice last year when Babylonia came out, and it was a bit more, harked back a little bit more to the older days of Knizia. It felt a lot more like his titles that were coming out in the early 2000s, rather than stuff that's coming out now in 2020. And it's as good as those games. You know, it's very satisfying, very strategic with a simple rule set. You know, one of those games that, you know, it's relatively easy to pick up and play it, but then you can play it really competitively, and really good players will do really, really well, you know, and you can really master it. The game looks really stylish in its production. Most of our board games, right, have kind of, over recent years, have gone for that childish aesthetic. You know, a lot of them have gone for a very cartoony sort of look, as that's become more acceptable for adults to sit around and play something with, as we've talked about previously, anthropomorphic animals and so on like that. You know, that in the past that would have been seen as something quite childish. Now that seems to be right there in the mainstream, I guess, raised by things like, you know, Disney Pixar films and stuff like that. It's become an acceptable thing as an adult to enjoy those things. But Babylonia harks back to that older era where board games were trying to look serious, you know, and historical and so on. And it's just nice to see something coming out in 2020 that harks back to you know, it's not that long ago, is it? But it feels like a previous era of board games. So this is something stylish, sophisticated, and something that you can play really competitively and get your teeth stuck into, but still not that complicated to get yourself started. Number 87 is Downfall of Pompeii. This game is by the designer of Carcassonne, which you've probably heard of. And here what we're doing is we're populating the city of Pompeii. So we're playing cards in order to allow us to put our people of our colour onto these various different buildings in the city of Pompeii. And then at a certain point in the game, and you don't know quite when it's coming, then the volcano will erupt. So a card will come out of the deck which says the volcano erupts. And now we play a totally different game, which is all about getting those people out of the city before the lava gets to them. And so on your turn, you're moving your own pieces out of the city as much as you can, but you're also placing lava tiles to try and block off the exits for your opponent's pieces. And when people get completely blocked off or covered by lava, then you pick up those playing pieces and you drop them in to the three-dimensional volcano that's provided in the game. And that's where the humour comes in. I mean, it's a really dark theme, isn't it? I mean, it's horrible when you think about it, but it is fun. It's one of those games that's totally sort of engaging because you know kind of the story, you know what's going on, you understand that these people are fleeing from a volcano, and these ones are getting out, but these ones haven't been able to, and they're getting cut off. There's a lot of drama, a lot of tension in there, but it's also abstracted that it doesn't feel dark and mean and nasty. I think it's a strange game in that it's got two different games essentially. You start out playing one thing and then it switches to something else about halfway through, but that switch is not clunky. It feels very natural. At the end of the game, you're going to score the people that have got out of the city, so it makes sense that you've got to get them into the city first because you've got to have a good bunch of people in there in order to get a substantial amount of people out of there. I think it's really good. It would be lovely to have a sort of slicker production. This one very much does look dated. It looks like it's from that previous era of board games. I don't know who owns the rights to it now because I believe it was a Mayfair game, and Mayfair have ceased to function as a business anymore. So I wonder when we'll see Downfall of Pompeii again. Surely it'll come back, and it would be lovely to see it in a bit more of a lavish production. Number 86 is Formula D. Now, Formula D is an old game, okay? This one's been around for I don't know how many years, a few decades, and it's in various different editions. There was Formula Day with a DE, and then it became Formula D just with a D. There was Formula D Mini, which I quite like because Formula D in its big box takes a little bit too long, particularly if you've got a lot of players. And then there's just tons and tons of expansion maps, different racetracks that you can use. A lot of those have long since gone out of print, and now they've become things that people really, they're really sought after sort of items, very, very expensive to get hold of. But there's plenty of these maps that are more freely available as well. So there's loads to get yourself stuck into. And at its core, it's got a really clever dice mechanism where essentially this is a roll and move game. So we roll the dice and we move around the track, and those games are well out of favour now. They're completely out of fashion. But I still find roll and move to be a really enjoyable mechanism when it's handled well. And here it's handled really well. So as I'm starting off with my car, I'm starting in the lowest gear, so I'm rolling a 4-sided dice. Then as I step up the gears, I'm on a 6-sided dice, an 8-sided dice. Now I'm on a 10-sided, 12-sided. Eventually I'll be on a 30-sided dice flying around that track. But the important thing is that I have to stop. I have to land in a certain section of the track at every corner. Otherwise, I'm going to go off the track. I'm going to take damage to my vehicle and so on. And so it's really simple. The dice are not a 30-sided dice. It's not a classic 30-sided dice where you could roll 1 or you could roll 30. That would be hugely swingy. No, the dice has a different distribution on it to make it a little bit more fair. But essentially, that mechanism is as described. You're rolling a bigger dice. You're taking greater risk. It's getting you around the track faster. But you could just slam into a corner and go off the track, take a great deal of damage, and eventually people will be falling off the track, because they've taken too many risks. So ultimately, this is a push your luck game, which is a type of game that I really, really enjoy. So Formula D feels like a system that, I've got no interest in Formula 1. I think if you did have an interest in Formula 1, this would be a fantastic game for you. But with no interest in Formula 1, I still really enjoy it just because I appreciate that push your luck aspect to it. And you don't need to know that much about Formula 1 to enjoy the game. The next game on the list, number 85, is If Wishes Were Fishes. Now, this is one that I think is totally overlooked. I got it in a bargain bin, in one of those sort of discount stores in the UK. It was obviously loads of stock left over, and so it was sold off extremely cheap. The game looks odd. It looks like a game for children. It's got this weird cartoony artwork, but the gameplay is not really like that at all. It's essentially an economic game where we're looking after sort of shares in certain types of fish. Different fish have different sort of stock prices, and we can adjust those by the way that we play. We've got a card drafting aspect to it, so we're taking cards from a central display, but we might have to pay in order to take cards further up the chain. The currency is these big rubbery worms, which are really odd, but really funny and weird. So those essentially function as coins. I've no idea why they chose to go with rubbery worms. I'm sort of glad that they did, although I suspect that's killed the game because I mean, who's playing this? Is this for children? It's too complicated. Is it for adults? Why have we got rubbery worms in it? You know, so it doesn't quite work as a product, but as an oddity and something that, I mean, the gameplay is solid. It's really, really good. This is one I frequently come back to. Okay, a couple of times a year, I'll be looking for what shall I play. There we go. If Wishes Were Fishes, and I've been doing that for years. Okay, so it's one that's never fallen out of favour with me. Yeah, I think if you can get hold of a bargain, I don't know if bargain copies are still around, it's been a few years now, but if you can get hold of a cheap copy of If Wishes Were Fishes, or even pay more expensive, you could do much worse than this game. Number 84 is another game like If Wishes Were Fishes, where we're talking about stocks, holding stocks and controlling the value of different sort of items. This is a really clever game. Again, sort of overlooked, sort of disappeared really from Ravensburger. It's an early example of polyomino games, so games with Tetris-style pieces, where you're placing those out on the board as buildings, and then you're trying to surround them with playing pieces of your colour. And when you have managed to surround it with your playing pieces, maybe some other playing pieces, you know, of another player's colour have got in there as well, then you'll be able to place a piece onto the central castle, and the colours showing on the top level of the castle dictate the value of these individual seals, which you'll be collecting throughout the game. There's little kickbacks if I complete surrounding one of these buildings, then other players who are also surrounding that building will get a bit of a kickback. It's a real classic style of game. It feels like something from it's from Rudiger Dawn, this game, but it feels like something from Kramer and Kiesling, you know, something that would fit in with Tikal and Java and Mexica and those games that were coming out in the early 2000s. Arkadia feels very much in that sort of realm, and I think it's a really good example. It's a solid game. There's nothing really that I could critique in it. I really enjoy it. It's pretty. It's attractive. Laid out on the table. It's gonna draw people's attention. What's that? Because of that central thing that you're building, but also the polyominoes and the little plastic sort of miniatures that you're placing around the board. Yeah, I think again, if you could get hold of a cheap copy of Arkadia, or even paying a little bit more for it, it's well worth your time. Number 83 is another Rainer Knizia game. So this one is Heckmeck, another one of his classics. It's also known as Pickomino, depending on which region you get this from. I've talked previously about the fact that I like dice games that don't rely on the Yahtzee mechanism, and this is one of those. In fact, that's it's the best thing I could say about it, really. This is a really simple dice game. All it is a dice and a few sort of scoring tiles. It's got the quirky Zoc Verlag artwork, the chickens and the worms and all of that just make it look a bit whimsical, but essentially it's just rolling dice, selecting which dice you want to use and how you want to use them. So there's some really clever mechanisms in there, really clever decisions, portable package. It's a classic. Pickomino, Hekmek. Yeah, I think if you enjoy rolling dice and playing simple games, go for this one, absolutely. Number 82 is the game Hive, which is a abstract strategy game. So essentially that means it's a game a bit like chess or checkers or something like that. Here we don't have a board. That's what's really interesting about this one. We've got these little hexagonal Bakelite tiles, and we position them around each other. Each one's got a little insect on it, and the insects all have different powers that sort of make sense, roughly, in relation to the insect, in so much as, you know, similar to in chess, you've got your playing pieces and they each have an individual power. Here we've got insects, and I suppose their powers make a little bit more sense than they do in chess, but similar sort of thing. Essentially the powers are just there to facilitate movement of the pieces, and you're trying to surround the opponent's queen with your playing pieces so that the queen can't escape. Really good abstract strategy game. Yeah, it's deep gameplay. Once you've learned the individual powers, it's pretty simple. Comes in lots of different editions, travel editions and larger editions and fancy black and white editions and so on. It's a classic, Hive. Number 81 is Adventureland, which is from Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling. And I've already mentioned Kramer and Kiesling on this list. Adventureland comes from the company Harbour. Now, Harbour is known for making children's games in bright yellow boxes, like this Rhino Hero Super Battle here, for young children. And a few years ago, they put out a range of games that were intended for families. And potentially adults. And Adventureland was one of the very first. And it's really good. It's hard to explain why it's good, but it's really good. Essentially, you've got a bunch of workers, they're not workers, a bunch of meeples, and they need to move along the grid, and they can move as far as they like along the grid, but they can never come back. So they can move to the right, they can move down, and they're gradually progressing into the different regions of the board, and you're trying to take a majority control of different regions, but the game comes with a bunch of different scenarios, so there's a lot of different rule sets that you can play. None of them are complex. They're all as good as each other. Sometimes you've got to fight little monsters and things like that. Some of your little characters will die as you go along. Simple rule set, nice accessible sort of theme. It's an odd one. It doesn't feel like any other game, but it's really good. So after our first 10 games on the top 100 list, we found that there were no publishers as front runners, but that situation has changed. We now have Rio Grande with 2 games on the list between 81 and 100, and the same situation for the publisher Blue Orange. So those are currently the front runners for the publishers. What about designers? Well, but in the first 10 games on the top 100, there were no front runners, but now if we go between 81 and 100, we can see that Rainer Knizia has 2 games. So Rainer Knizia is the most prolific board game designer in the world, and he's already on my list twice. The only designer so far to manage that. With regards to themes, in our first 10, so 91 to 100, we had anthropomorphic animals pushing through. So there were 2 games with that. Now we've got 3 games with anthropomorphic animals, but we've got 2 games set in the ancient world. So we've got a little push from ancient world to try and catch up. So we'll see what happens with that throughout these lists. In terms of game style, in our first 10, we had flicking and dice games being my most favoured types of games, styles of games. And now that situation has changed. So dice games has pushed ahead. Flicking, stock holding, tile laying, area majority, and games that we play under time pressure are my favoured types of games between 81 and 100. So there we go. That's the current state of play. Let's see what happens in the games numbers 80 down to 71.